Attacks against civilians by the Sudanese government and their militia allies have driven almost 2 million people from their homes. Most of those people are still stuck inside the Darfur region of western Sudan. Some of them, about 200,000, have crossed over into the neighboring country of Chad. I traveled to Chad to meet the refugees and to hear their stories. The landscape I saw was incredibly harsh. This is the desert that these people had to cross in order to get to Chad. In some cases, they traveled for as much as 2 or 3 weeks. It's also the type of terrain that extends into Darfur. I talked to refugees stretched over hundreds of kilometers, and I was struck by how consistent their stories were. The camps are sponsored by the United Nations and run by international non-governmental organizations. In some cases, there are not enough tents for everyone, so people are living in makeshift structures that they've constructed out of sticks, cloth that they may have brought with them, and sheeting that is given to them by the international aid organizations. Some of the people that I met were not yet in camps. In fact, they were literally living under trees. This is one woman I met shortly after she crossed over with a group of 60 other refugees. You can see surrounding her the things that she brought with her when she fled her village after it was attacked. Some blankets, some pots, some jugs, and a little bit of clothing. One thing that's very difficult to see is that she has 2 bullet wounds in her right leg, one just below the knee and one just under her right foot. She was shot when she and a 17-year-old girl went to a well to try to get water for themselves and for the rest of the refugees that they were fleeing with. There was a Sudanese soldier guarding the well. Now think about that for a minute. It's one thing to drive people from their homes and into the desert, but it's another to guard the wells so that they can't get water to help sustain themselves. I met a number of people who had been attacked by aircraft, often as they were fleeing their villages. The Sudanese government has denied any connection to the so-called Janjaweed militia, but the fact is the militia do not have aircraft. The Sudanese government does. This woman's name is Hawa, and I was sitting in her little hut with her and her children and an older neighbor and a translator, and she told me the story of the day that her village was attacked. On that day, her father was killed, and her brother was killed, and her mother disappeared. After she had told me her story, I thanked her, and I started to leave, and she started speaking in a very low voice. "What about my mother? What about my mother? I don't know where my mother is." And I felt as though she were asking me to give her an answer, which I couldn't possibly do. One group that I talked to comprised a couple of older gentlemen, some women and children. And after I'd listened to their stories of having villages attacked and men and boys killed and property stolen, this older gentleman looked at me and he made this gesture that I captured with my camera, folding his hands and ducking his head. And he said, "Well, now this grandfather can be happy because I know that somebody is taking our stories back." It was very important to almost all the refugees I talked to tell their stories, and they had this poignant faith that people would care. These people in Chad, the Darfurians, so much want to keep from feeling abandoned. Even in the camps in Chad, malnutrition is a problem. In the camps that I visited, Doctors Without Borders was operating a nutritional feeding center where they were identifying children who were malnourished. Inside Darfur, the situation is also very serious, and it's exacerbated by obstacles that the Sudanese government has placed in the way of international assistance. At one camp, the refugees had created a list of massacres. They had written it out in rough English because they wanted to share it with people who came to visit and to interview them, such as myself. On this sheet, they've identified the number who died, where the massacre took place, the kind of attack. When they use the letters GA, that's short for Janjaweed, their term for the government-allied militias. And the other word on the first line is Antonov, which is the name of the type of aircraft that the Sudanese government often uses. There are, of course, many children in the camps. Like children everywhere, they're living in the moment. They're playing, they're smiling, they're laughing. Other children, though, show the effects of the burdens that they're bearing. Some seem to me traumatized. But the question that I kept asking myself, and I myself am the father of 2 small daughters, was what future do these children have? And for the children who are still inside Darfur, do they even have a future? A daily occurrence during the time that I was in the camps was a sandstorm. In the middle of the day, at noon, you could barely see 100 yards because there was so much sand whipping in the air. And to me, that captures the condition that the Darfurians are in. They're in the middle of a storm, and it's very difficult to see what the future will bring. But what will happen will depend upon choices that are made, certainly on the ground in Darfur, choices that are made in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, but also choices that are made in Washington and by citizens in the United States.